So let's kick off. Doug,
Thank
would
you.
like to start?
Thank you. I'm quite pleased to see such a number of people able to come out on a rainy Friday afternoon to talk about rural to urban transition, which is, a great way to kick off the weekend and so on. But I'm going to be talking in fairly broad brush strokes about a topic that many of you probably are aware of many of the fine details of, and have a much greater awareness of specific programs and policy areas than I do. What I've done in Arrival City is try to provide a broad overview of what I think is a neglected area in public understanding and to some extent in policy as well, which is the transitional urban neighborhood, what I might call the bottom rung urban neighborhood that still has a link to the originating village and is not yet fully linked but wants to be into the established urban economy. I'm calling these arrival cities, which might frustrate some people because there are a number of names in scholarship and policy for these neighborhoods already, but in large part in order to draw attention to their transitional nature, to the fact that they're not static appendages of poor people that have suddenly appeared on the edge of cities, but are serving a function and a set of functions both in rural life and in urban life. The background to it is this sort of statistic that we're seeing here, which is the chart of urbanization around the world with those orange and yellow lines representing what we might call the developing world at this point. We can argue about what exactly is rural and what exactly is urban, and when exactly the threshold was crossed of the 50-50 point. It seemed that there was a while during the last decade when every year for about 5 years, one international agency or another would declare that the world had become 50% urban, and it's a fairly useless number anyway because it doesn't really mean anything other than to get people excited about these things. But that transition's occurring. It's not entirely occurring by people getting on trains and moving to the city all of a sudden. I think that's a myth that needs to be dispelled. And I think it's one I held when several years ago I set out on this book and went to about 20 cities on 5 continents to look at these transitional neighborhoods. I think I started out believing that I would be able to find and open a chapter with a family somewhere in some remote village, packing up all their belongings and getting on a train or a bus or some form of transportation and moving to the city. It simply doesn't happen that way anywhere in the world. It didn't happen to us when our ancestors urbanized. It doesn't happen really anywhere. You have a sequence of moves and temporary locations from rural areas into marginal life in the city, usually starting with temporary work, with seasonal work and so on, and building up accretions of permanence, if you will, in the city. And sometimes forming neighborhoods, sometimes engaging in rent or informal title activities to gain ownership of some plot of land and so on. But you have a threshold, what the geographer Ronald Skeldon called the migration transition, at which point a family in a village or a whole village will see itself as being an urban family with some people in the village rather than being a rural family with some people working in the city. And then the idea of support comes to work the other way. But an important point that I'm trying to make is to break down this idea that there is a firmly rural and there is a firmly urban, and that they are separate development challenges and so on. And to argue that what I'm calling the arrival city neighborhood is crucial to both of them, because it's the place where people urbanize, but it's also the place where the village gets developed. And we could name a whole list of countries at this point where rural incomes are now coming mainly from remittances from cities within their own country, rather than from agricultural income. And this would include China, which at some point in the last 5 years reached the point where its largest source of rural income was remittances from the city. Poland, for example, which its remittances from international people from the daughter cleaning toilets in the city of London now exceed agricultural income, EU subsidies, and Polish government subsidies combined, and so on. So these linkage points are important. I was going to open with an example from one of the places I visited, but just to get us started with something pertinent to the moment, I'd like to talk about this arrival city neighborhood, which is called Bulak al-Dakrur, which is on the west of Cairo, and is a neighborhood that formed from wasteland of ambiguous ownership and generally public ownership starting in the 1970s mainly. There was some settlements there before, but quickly grew after the 1970s as villagers from upper Egypt moved in, set up informal housing, built their own places, claimed ownership, and sometimes purchased ownership from subdivided land and so on, and occasionally moved in from other apparently more pleasant looking slums into this one because of the economic activities here. Why is it relevant now? It was the neighborhood that on January 25th of this year produced the first crowds of people who stormed Tahrir Square and began the protest, were willing to face the security forces and possible grave danger and so on. And the organizers of those protests, who tended to come from a more established middle class, knew that the youth here were going to be the people who would do this, because there's a great history of opposition to the Mubarak regime from within this neighborhood. These neighborhoods are called ashwayat in Egypt, which roughly means, as far as I can tell, means chaotic or disordered places. And as with many cities in the developing world, about a third of the population lives in these haphazard places in Cairo. And it's worth looking at the history of why people became so resistant to the regime. Two things are at work. First of all, as in many other developing countries, you are starting to get the very bottom of a middle class, or the top of a working class, you could say, emerging out of the merchants and so on, the people who've been able to have stable ownership of their shacks in this neighborhood, who are beginning to get frustrated by the inability to move beyond very informal economic activity, but have made enough money that they're interested in getting their kids into school and so on, and who are running up against the established middle class of what you might call downtown Cairo, the people who were in the old regime class and so on. And those aspirations are very much blocked. You see, even after liberalizing their economy in the early 1990s, Egypt's better economic and educational opportunities remained largely closed to the new classes emerging from this place. And this has caused a lot of frustration, as has Egypt's various efforts and the efforts of many international development organizations and NGOs to redevelop and rehouse people in these neighborhoods, some of which have been intelligent and worthy in recent years, but certainly the history of responses to neighborhoods like Bulak has been one that has frustrated the people who live there. Egypt has repeatedly tried to rehouse the people in the Ashwayat neighborhoods in planned high-rise housing developments further out from the city, which I would argue, at least in its initial forms of these policies, misunderstood the nature of these neighborhoods and their function in providing a rural development transition into urban life, in that these housing developments tended to offer, while technically were more pleasant places to live, offered no flexibility in space. They offered no entrepreneurial opportunities within the building. You could not open a shop on the ground floor of your own house or turn your house into a small factory, as people within places like Bulak would do. Instead, you had strict housing, and you were also fairly removed from the core market of the city. So the people from central Cairo could not come to your little shop or whatever and buy your goods. It was harder to manufacture things. If you had an actual job, which probably covers more people than those who are self-employed, it was very, very difficult to reach the places of employment or so on. This is a constant problem with rehousing projects. They've recently become more intelligent with the redevelopment, but still, if you look at the physical space, Bulak remains, it has physical barriers to its own ambitions that are preventing people from making the progress they'd like, much of which has to do with the canals and railway lines that isolate it from the main city, even though it seems to be close and so on. And that prevents all of the things I'm talking about. It prevents market access, prevents physical access. It often takes more than an hour just to get out of the neighborhood to your job around these canals and so on. And even though there's been some good progress with agencies recognizing that that these people take pride in their ownership of their shack and would like to raise the property value, there have been some good initiatives at upgrading. There are still these physical barriers, which are a big explanation of why the frustrations arose out of the Ashwayat and why suddenly you had groups of people who were willing to risk their lives to challenge the regime and so on. So where does a transitional neighborhood like this go? It could go the direction that we saw in Istanbul, which formed a big, sort of the beginning of this book was my work in Istanbul and my recognition that what had happened in the outskirts of Istanbul sort of represented a full cross-section and history of everything that can happen in a transitional urban neighborhood in an arrival city. Certainly, I think we all know that Istanbul grew from being about 900,000 people at the beginning of the 1960s to something like 14 million today, largely through a process of migration from the Anatolian center of Turkey and from the southeast and far east into the outskirts, with self-built neighborhoods known as Geçikondu accumulating around the outsides, the arrived overnight people. And this was that period in the 1970s when many, many cities were developing these things and didn't really know what to do with them. In South America, in the Middle East, beginning in East Asia and so on. And the responses were usually hostile. They were attempts to regulate them, to rehouse them, to bulldoze them and so on. And that caused political eruptions in the outskirts of Istanbul, which I would argue were the main cause of the military coup of 1980, was it? And so on. It was a response to political challenges from the Geçikondu outskirts. And what was interesting in Turkey was that almost by accident, the response ended up stabilizing these places in that the military or the post-military regime government very quickly decided to recognize these places as legitimate, mainly as a quick way to solve the problem, and formalized the property ownership of the people who lived in there, and it was a process that was extended over the years to new people who migrated inward, which didn't solve all the problems, but it allowed a large number of people in the outskirts of Istanbul and some other Turkish cities to turn their shacks into 5-story buildings and gain rental income and open up various shops on the ground floor, or to sell out completely and use that money to start something else somewhere else and so on. But the result was the formation of an outskirts middle class in Turkey, which certainly was not very stable at first and still has its challenges. The physical space is tricky, the legal space is tricky there. But they became successful enough that they became the dominant middle class of Turkey. And the party arising from them has governed Turkey for the last decade, and I would argue in a fairly stable, economically open and democratic way, not without its flaws, but we're starting to see an era where the rural migrant outskirts are developing their own middle classes that are becoming dominant and are governing in Brazil, in Turkey, and so on. And this is producing stability and so on. If you can get these neighborhoods under control, recognize their function, it can reduce the tensions that emerge from the outskirts. these neighborhoods are not unknown in the development world, to put it mildly, although there's a history of them being recognized as static slums, as places that just happen to be neighborhoods full of poor people, which I think has distorted a lot of the policy responses and development responses and NGO responses to these neighborhoods. In recent years, there's been some fairly enlightened understanding of their transitional nature from some quarters, but I would argue that still there are some difficulties, and there are some very useful policy lessons to be learned in the ways some countries and some agencies have managed to respond to the challenges of these places. If I can just offer a thumbnail of how I see the development history of the arrival city, there was a great recognition of them in the 1970s that these neighborhoods were not simply going to be pushed away and so on, and we got a lot of policies coming out of the World Bank and so on, which were experimenting with upgrading of the housing and so on, and the beginnings of what then was called sites and services policy, which was a fairly enlightened understanding that yes, you're going to have people moving into the cities. Why not instead use space on the land that they're going to occupy and pre-provide infrastructure and plumbing and sewage and services and graded land and so on for people, which was tried for a number of years, and as far as I can understand was abandoned for a number of reasons, partly the instability developing in a lot of these countries by the end of the 1970s, but also because nobody at the time was able to get around the challenge of understanding that these neighborhoods are places, the poor people who live in them usually are speculating on their property value in some way or another, and that something like an upgrading or a sites and services policy is raising the value of the land above the attainable point for somebody moving in from a poor village. And they're becoming something other than neighborhoods, they're becoming second or third rung neighborhoods rather than bottom rung neighborhoods. And we saw a whole range of policy attempts failed because of these market phenomena, which weren't very well understood at the time. We saw classic examples in Africa where fairly impressive looking rehousing projects were done, but they were done up to minimal building codes, which meant that the apartments were about 4 times the size of the average slum shack. And what that meant was the people would move in and subdivide them into 4 windowless apartments inside it, or sell the whole thing and so on, and actually end up with worse housing than they had before. Although I'd argue that you know, on some level you're creating more space for people, so it could work. And a lot of things got abandoned, I think, by agencies during the 1980s, in part because a lot of these countries were going through very severe crises during the 1980s in South America and the Indian subcontinent and the Middle East and so on. There was not a lot happening, but also because there weren't a lot of deliverables in what government agencies and NGOs wanted from these projects. You didn't have an easily quantifiable place where you could sink some money and produce a measurable return immediately. And there was a move during the 1980s from some governments to strictly looking at land titling in these urban areas as the be-all and end-all solution. I think what some people would call the Hernando de Soto approach to things, which was simply to offer formalization and land titling and so on as a solution, which was an important part of these things. I think it's hard to find anywhere where people don't recognize their property value as an important part of their portfolio in the city, even fairly marginal people. But it didn't answer all the questions, and I think there's a pretty big volume of work which shows that actual titled ownership in the legal sense isn't actually that important. Property markets work well, here. Very briefly, this is Liugang in Chongqing, China, which is part of I opened the book with this place. It's got about 200,000 people spread across a huge expanse of self-built housing and an extremely thriving property market within it. None of it legal at all, and so on, but has been used to create quite a thriving class within the slum. There's garment industries like this, metalworking industries, bathtub making industries like this, and so on. And in fact, the effort by the Chongqing regional government to legalize and to give formal title within this area has had a very damaging effect on the economy within it, because it's actually disrupted the informal property market within it and required a set of bureaucratic activities that really can't be managed by people within and so on. So just briefly to get us up to the present, in recent years there have been some very intelligent things done in some places to get around these problems of the arrival city, of the bottom rung urban neighborhood being a nebulous place with a lot of things going in and out from the village and the city, and not the easily deliverable policy effect you get from working on a village as a village, or on an urban area as an urban area. I would look at what's being done in Colombia and Peru and some parts of Brazil in terms of more enlightened sites and services programs, where you recognize that the property value is going to be affected by your intervention, and you create value capture mechanisms to allow the poor people moving in to profit from that value increase of the property. And there's some very intelligent things being done on that. In the Western world, we're seeing examples of that as well, where a lot of the redevelopment projects in Toronto, where I come from originally, there's some very intelligent stuff done with taking the terrible old public housing buildings and financing their own redevelopment using their rising property value and so on. This can be done at the bottom end of the property market as well, and it's worth looking at those examples. And I would look at the examples in Brazil, particularly in the São Paulo area, which has had a lot more experience than Rio, and without getting noticed as much, and which has developed the idea of intervening all at once in every manner of property, coming in, developing rather than doing an upgrading thing where you do a foundation and then you do electricity and so on. You have about 5 agencies all come in at once with a sort of shock attack, and produce a local community police force, give everyone a street address, which is very, very important in this context, provide street lighting, also very, very important and often neglected, provide job training centers and so on, and as well as upgrading people's housing. Very important to do the statistical stuff, I think, is what the Brazilians have found, is having a street address and so on, much more important than formal title, makes you both a legal worker, you can get a legal job and receive a paycheck, and also a legal taxpayer and so on. So it makes you part of the economy. And I think a key to these neighborhoods, not necessarily formalizing them in the sense of giving people a job with a lifetime contract and a pension and so on, but in making them legal citizens of the city through a recognition of them and their neighborhoods as being part of the city. If there's sort of a cosmic lesson from all of these places, it's that if you have a significant population of people in your city living there on a permanent basis who are not legal citizens of your country or of your city, then they are going to spiral into negative social effects. They're not going to be able to invest in their small businesses. They're not going to be able to buy their house in any way that they can profit from. They're not going to be able to put their children into post-secondary education, to say nothing of secondary education, and they're going to become a dangerous underclass. If you can allow them to become residents of the city in the proper bureaucratic and citizenship and physical sense, in terms of physical access to markets and so on, then you can get an upward spiral of development. You can de-interrupt the trajectory that the people had in mind when they made the huge investment to move into these neighborhoods from the village. That investment is remembered many years after these neighborhoods have failed, because it is the entire village back there is depending on these people's ability to progress. And if you can remove the barriers to the trajectories that they know and understand very well and have invested in, then you can turn a very troubled peripheral urban neighborhood into one that is able to succeed on its own.
Doug, thank you very much indeed. Very well timed as well, and a nice closing discussion about not conflating kind of assets and land titling with legitimacy and citizenship. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to move straight now to